The summer heat pressed down on Brooklyn's streets like a heavyweight's fist. Children played in the spray of fire hydrants while their mothers watched from stoops, fanning themselves with old magazines. It was the kind of day where tensions ran high and tempers flared easily. Nobody expected that by sunset, the entire neighborhood would be talking about what happened on Fulton Street. Mike Tyson had been walking alone, something he rarely did anymore. Fame had made simple walks complicated, turning every street corner into a potential stage. But today felt different. He needed air, needed to feel the pulse of his old neighborhood without bodyguards or cameras following his every step. The streets of Brownsville had raised him, shaped him into the fighter he became. Now, at 32, with controversies behind him and questions about his future ahead, he craved that connection to his roots. The first sign of trouble came from Marcus, a 17-year-old who recognized the heavyweight immediately. Marcus had grown up watching Tyson's fights on fuzzy television screens in corner stores, dreaming of his own boxing glory. When he spotted the legend walking past a bodega where he worked, excitement overtook caution. "Yo, Mike Tyson," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the busy street. "Man, you're my hero." Tyson turned, offering a slight nod. He had learned to manage these moments, to give fans what they needed without losing himself in the process. But today, something in Marcus's voice touched him. The young man's eyes held the same hunger Tyson remembered from his own youth, the desperate need to believe that escape was possible. "You box, kid?" Tyson asked, his voice softer than his public persona suggested. Marcus's face lit up. "Every day, man. Training at the gym on Atlantic. Coach says I got potential." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the magnetic presence of the former champion. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood's invisible network. Within minutes, 20 people surrounded them, then 50, then more. Phones appeared, though not everyone had them yet, in 1998. People pressed closer, eager to witness this unexpected encounter. Tyson felt the familiar pressure building. The crowd's energy was infectious but overwhelming. He could sense their expectations, their need for him to be larger than life. Some wanted autographs, others just wanted to be near greatness. A few elderly residents watched from a distance, remembering when he was just another troubled kid from the projects. "Give him some space," called out Mrs. Rodriguez, who had known Tyson since he was 12. She had watched him transform from an angry young man into a champion, then watched the world change him in return. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen it all, but the crowd was growing restless. The situation shifted when someone shouted from the back of the crowd, "Ask him about the fight. Ask him if he's scared." The voice was challenging, provocative. Tyson's jaw tightened. He had spent years learning to control his temper, but the old instincts never fully disappeared. A teenager pushed forward, phone recording despite the poor quality cameras of the era. "Mike, you coming back? People saying you lost your edge, that you ain't the same fighter." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. This was no longer a simple fan encounter. It had become something more volatile, a moment where past and present collided on a hot summer street. Tyson felt trapped, not by physical barriers, but by the weight of expectations and the hunger in dozens of eyes. That's when the police sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. Someone had called in a disturbance, concerned about the growing crowd blocking traffic. What they didn't know was that they were about to step into a powder keg, where a community's frustrations with authority would collide with their protective instincts toward one of their own. Officer Janet Martinez was the first to arrive, her patrol car sliding to a stop at the crowd's edge. She was 28, had grown up in Queens, and understood the dynamics of neighborhood gatherings. But she also knew that crowds could turn dangerous quickly, especially when celebrities were involved. Her partner, Officer Tom Sullivan, was less familiar with the area's rhythms. He saw only disorder that needed immediate control. As the officer stepped out of their car, the crowd's mood shifted again. The excitement of meeting Tyson mixed with the tension that police presence always brought to these streets. Some people began to back away, while others moved protectively closer to the former champion. The stage was set for a confrontation that nobody wanted but everyone could feel coming. Tyson stood in the center of it all, No longer just a man taking a walk. He had become the focal point of something much larger than himself, a symbol around which the neighborhood's pride, frustration, and hope would collide with authorities' need for order. The spark had been lit, and the fuse was burning fast. Officer Martinez approached the crowd with measured steps, her hand resting casually on her radio, but not on her weapon. She had learned from experience that how you entered a situation often determined how it would end. The crowd parted slightly, creating a narrow path toward the center, where Tyson stood talking quietly with Marcus. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her voice carrying across the now silent group. The question seemed simple enough, but everyone understood it carried weight. This was the moment when a peaceful gathering could become something else entirely. Tyson looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Just talking with some neighbors, officer. No trouble here." His voice was calm, controlled, but those who knew him could hear the underlying tension. He had dealt with law enforcement many times, and these encounters rarely went smoothly for someone with his history. Officer Sullivan, however, saw the situation differently. From his perspective, this was a crowd control issue waiting to explode. Traffic was backing up as drivers slowed to see what was happening. More people were arriving every minute, drawn by the commotion. He counted at least 70 people now, with more streaming from nearby buildings. "We need to disperse this crowd," Sullivan announced, his voice sharp with authority. "You're blocking the street and creating a public safety hazard." The crowd's reaction was immediate and negative. Murmurs of discontent rippled through the group. This was their neighborhood, their street, and their hero. Why should they have to leave just because 2 cops showed up? Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her weathered face showing decades of dealing with official interference in community life. "Officer, these are good people having a conversation," she said, her accent thick but her English clear. "Nobody's doing anything wrong here. Mr. Tyson was just talking to the children about boxing." But Sullivan wasn't interested in explanations. He had protocols to follow and a situation to control. "Ma'am, I need you to step back. Everyone needs to move along now. This gathering is becoming disorderly." That word hung in the air like a challenge. Disorderly. To the crowd, it felt like an accusation, an attempt to criminalize their natural desire to connect with someone who represented their community's greatest success story. Several young men moved closer to Tyson, their body language becoming more protective. Martinez sensed the shift and tried to de-escalate. "Look, nobody's in trouble. We just need to keep the street clear for traffic. Maybe move the conversation to the sidewalk." Her suggestion might have worked if not for what happened next. A young woman named Keisha, who had been recording the encounter on her phone, stepped forward to get a better angle. In doing so, she accidentally bumped into Officer Sullivan. He spun around, grabbing her wrist instinctively. "Hey, don't touch her," shouted Marcus, the same teenager who had first called out to Tyson. His voice cracked with adolescent outrage and protective instinct. The crowd pressed forward, suddenly transformed from curious observers into defenders. Tyson felt the change immediately. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension. He had been in enough volatile situations to recognize when things were about to spiral beyond control. But he also understood something the officers didn't. This wasn't really about him anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and the long history between this community and law enforcement. "Everyone stay calm," Tyson said, raising his hands. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." But Sullivan wasn't backing down. Still holding Keisha's wrist, he called for backup on his radio. The crackling response was audible to everyone nearby. "Units en route, ETA 2 minutes." The sound of those words sent another wave of tension through the crowd. Backup meant this was serious. It meant someone thought there was real danger here. "You're hurting me," Keisha said, trying to pull away from Sullivan's grip. She was 19, studying at Brooklyn College, and had never been in trouble with police before. Her fear was genuine and visible, and it triggered something primal in the people around her. "Let her go." The shout came from multiple voices now. The crowd was no longer a collection of individuals, but a single entity with shared anger and purpose. They began to close ranks, forming a protective circle around Tyson, Keisha, and the confrontation that was escalating by the second. Martinez made one more attempt at peace. Tom let her go. She wasn't doing anything wrong. But her partner's adrenaline was pumping now. He saw only a crowd growing more hostile by the minute, and a young woman who had physically contacted an officer. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and everyone knew that whatever happened next would happen fast. For more police cars were racing toward them, carrying officers who would arrive with limited information and high expectations of trouble. The crowd understood this math. More cops meant someone was getting arrested, possibly hurt. Tyson found himself at the center of forces beyond his control. To his left, Marcus and several other young men were shouting at Sullivan. To his right, Mrs. Rodriguez was trying to organize the older residents to form a barrier between the confrontation and the children who had gathered. Behind him, dozens of people were pulling out phones, preparing to document whatever happened next. He realized that his simple walk through the neighborhood had become something much more significant. Every choice he made in the next few minutes would ripple through this community for years to come. He could try to leave, but that might look like abandonment to people who saw him as their champion. He could get involved, but his presence might escalate things further. Or he could stay and try to be a calming force, risking his own safety and legal status. The approaching sirens were almost on top of them now. Sullivan still hadn't released Keisha's wrist. The crowd was growing angrier and more protective, and Mike Tyson stood in the eye of a storm that was about to break with devastating force. The pressure had been building slowly, but now it was reaching the breaking point. What happened next would determine whether this became a story of community coming together or a tragedy that tore it apart. The first backup car arrived with screeching brakes, its occupants leaping out with hands already moving toward their equipment belts. Officers Chun and Williams had been told they were responding to a crowd control situation with possible celebrity involvement, but the scene that greeted them looked far more volatile than their dispatcher had described. 75 people now surrounded the original confrontation, with more arriving as word spread through the neighborhood's network of kids on bikes and mothers calling to each other from windows. The crowd had formed into concentric circles, an inner ring of younger residents standing protectively close to Tyson and Keisha, a middle ring of family members and friends, and an outer ring of curious observers who had come to see what all the commotion was about. Officer Sullivan finally released Keisha's wrist, but the damage was done. Red marks were visible on her dark skin, and she was rubbing the area while tears of frustration and humiliation rolled down her cheeks. The sight of a young woman in distress acted like gasoline on the crowd's simmering anger. "You see what they did to her?" called out a voice from the crowd. "Just for trying to record. This is America, ain't it?" Tyson watched the scene unfold with growing concern. He had seen situations like this before, moments when misunderstanding and fear combined to create something dangerous for everyone involved. But he had never been at the center of one quite like this, where his presence seemed to amplify every emotion in the crowd. Officer Chun, the senior officer among the reinforcements, tried to assess the situation quickly. He could see that Sullivan was rattled, Martinez was trying to mediate, and the crowd was becoming increasingly agitated. His training told him to establish control immediately, but his experience warned him that aggressive tactics might make things worse. "What's the situation here?" Chun asked Martinez, keeping his voice low, but knowing the crowd was listening to every word. "Started as a fan meet and greet," Martinez replied quietly. "Mr. Tyson was talking with residents. Crowd got large. We asked them to disperse, and things escalated when Officer Sullivan detained the young woman." Chun nodded, understanding immediately. This was the kind of situation that could explode in seconds or dissolve just as quickly, depending on how it was handled. He looked toward Tyson, recognizing both an opportunity and a risk. The former champion's presence was clearly important to these people, but it was also the reason the crowd existed in the first place. "Mr. Tyson," Chun said, approaching respectfully, "I wonder if you might help us here. These people obviously care about you, and we want everyone to stay safe." Tyson appreciated the officer's tone, but he could feel the crowd's expectations pressing down on him. They wanted him to stand up to authority, to be the fighter they remembered. But he also knew that one wrong move could turn this into something tragic. "I want everyone to stay safe too, officer," Tyson replied, his voice carrying to the crowd. "But I also want you to understand that these are good people. They're not causing trouble. They're just proud to have someone from their neighborhood succeed." His words seemed to calm some tensions, but then Officer Williams, the youngest cop on the scene, made a critical error. Nervous about the crowd's size and energy, he began speaking into his radio about potential riot situation and requesting additional units. The word riot rippled through the crowd like electricity. People who had been merely curious became defensive. Parents who had been watching from a distance began calling their children closer. Young men who had been content to observe started moving toward the front of the group. "Riot!" shouted Marcus, his voice cracking with indignation. "We're having a conversation. What riot?" The crowd's anger focused on Williams, who suddenly found himself facing dozens of hostile faces. His hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, a gesture that everyone noticed and no one misunderstood. The mood shifted again, from anger to something approaching fear. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been trying to keep the peace, stepped between the young officer and the crowd. "Mijo," she said to Williams, using the Spanish term of endearment despite her anger. "You put your hand down. These are families here. Children." But Williams was too frightened to think clearly. He saw only a large, hostile crowd pressing closer, threatening his safety and that of his fellow officers. His training kicked in, and he began shouting orders. "Everyone back up. Move away from the officers. This is your final warning." The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge. Final warning before what? Before arrests? Before violence? The crowd understood the implications and reacted accordingly. Instead of backing away, they pressed closer together, forming a protective mass around Tyson and Keisha. Tyson realized the situation had reached a critical point. Every instinct told him to fight, to protect these people who were protecting him. But he also understood that his actions would be magnified, analyzed, and judged by the world beyond this street corner. He was no longer just Mike Tyson the individual. He was a symbol of something larger. "Listen to me," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with surprising gentleness. He was speaking to everyone, the crowd, the officers, the children watching from doorways. "I know you're angry. I know you feel disrespected, but I also know that someone could get hurt here, and I can't let that happen." His words created a momentary pause, a space for reflection, but it was broken by the arrival of 3 more police cars, their sirens wailing and lights flashing. The new officers emerged ready for confrontation, having been told they were responding to a riot in progress. The sight of 8 police officers facing off against 75 community members created a visual that told its own story. This was no longer about a celebrity meeting fans, or even about a misunderstood detention. It had become a symbol of everything that was wrong between police and community, authority and citizen, power and powerlessness. In that moment, standing at the center of forces beyond his control, Mike Tyson made a decision that would define not only this incident, but his relationship with his community for years to come. He stepped forward, placing himself literally between the two sides, and prepared to do something that would either save the situation or make it infinitely worse. The breaking point had arrived, and everyone on Fulton Street was about to discover what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, each second stretched taut with tension and consequence. Tyson stepped into the narrow space between the police line and the front edge of the crowd, his massive frame suddenly the only barrier between 2 forces rushing toward collision. "Nobody moves," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded boxing rings around the world. "Not the police, not the community. We're going to figure this out right here, right now." But the arrival of the additional officers had changed the chemistry completely. Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior officer among the new arrivals, had been briefed by radio about a large hostile crowd threatening officers. He emerged from his car expecting to find a riot in progress. Not a tense, but still manageable situation. "All civilians need to disperse immediately," he announced through a bullhorn, his voice amplified and mechanical. Anyone who refuses to leave will be arrested for unlawful assembly. The ultimatum hit the crowd like a physical blow. These were people who lived here, worked here, raised their families here. Being ordered to leave their own neighborhood felt like the ultimate insult. A wave of angry shouts rose from the group, voices overlapping in outrage and defiance. "This is our street," someone yelled. "We got rights," called another voice. "They can't make us leave." Tyson felt the mood shift beneath his feet, like the ground moving during an earthquake. The crowd's anger was transforming into something harder and more dangerous. He could see it in the way people's postures changed. Hands clenching into fists, feet shifting into defensive stances. These weren't rioters or criminals. They were ordinary people pushed past their breaking point. Young Marcus, still burning with the injustice he had witnessed, made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and began recording, moving closer to document the police response. But in the chaos and confusion, Officer Williams interpreted the movement as aggressive. "He's got something in his hands," Williams shouted, his voice high with fear and adrenaline. Time seemed to splinter into fragments. Williams reached for his weapon. The crowd surged forward protectively. Tyson spun toward the young officer, his hands raised. And in that split second of confusion and panic, someone in the crowd threw a bottle. The glass shattered against the pavement near Officer Chen's feet, and everything exploded at once. "That's assault on an officer," Sergeant Rodriguez bellowed into his bullhorn. "Everyone on the ground now." But the crowd wasn't getting on the ground. Instead, they pressed forward, surrounding Tyson completely. Parents began grabbing their children, trying to get them away from what was rapidly becoming a dangerous confrontation. But there was nowhere to go. They were hemmed in by buildings on one side and more arriving police cars on the other. Tyson found himself at the absolute center of the chaos. People were grabbing at him, some trying to protect him, others trying to use him as a shield. He could feel the crowd's panic and anger washing over him in waves. These weren't strangers. These were his neighbors, people he had grown up with, families he recognized. "Stop," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Everybody stop." For a moment, his command carried weight. The crowd hesitated, the police paused, and in that brief silence, everyone could hear the sound of more sirens approaching. A lot more sirens. Officer Martinez, who had been trying to maintain calm throughout the entire incident, made one last attempt at de-escalation. "Sergeant, these people aren't violent. They're just scared and angry. If we can just talk to them." Officer Martinez, step back. Rodriguez cut her off. "This is now a public safety emergency. All units, prepare for crowd control measures." Those words, crowd control measures, sent a chill through everyone who heard them. The community members knew what that meant. Pepper spray, batons, mass arrests. The possibility of serious violence suddenly became very real. Keisha, still rubbing her wrist where Sullivan had grabbed her, began crying harder. The sight of her tears seemed to galvanize the crowd's protective instincts. Several women moved to surround her, creating a human barrier between the young woman and the police. "Look what you did to her," Mrs. Rodriguez called out, her voice shaking with emotion. "She's just a baby, a college student. Why are you treating us like criminals?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Everyone knew the real reasons. Years of mistrust, decades of misunderstandings, centuries of power imbalances that played out in moments like this. But knowing the reasons didn't make the situation any less dangerous. Tyson realized that his presence, which had started as a blessing for the community, had become a curse. His celebrity had drawn the crowd. His history with law enforcement had made the police nervous, and his symbolic importance had made everyone reluctant to back down. He was trapped in a role he had never asked for but couldn't escape. That's when he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of trying to calm the situation or encourage people to leave, he stepped directly in front of Sergeant Rodriguez and looked him in the eye. "You want to arrest someone?" Tyson said, his voice quiet but carrying to every person on the street. "Start with me. I'm the reason they're here. I'm the one you're really worried about." The crowd fell silent, stunned by his words. The police officers looked at each other uncertainly. Nobody had expected this development. Tyson was volunteering to be arrested, potentially defusing the entire situation by removing himself from the equation. But Rodriguez hesitated. Arresting Mike Tyson would create a media firestorm, bring national attention to what was supposed to be a routine crowd control situation. On the other hand, allowing the former champion to dictate terms would set a dangerous precedent. In that moment of hesitation, with everyone watching and waiting, the sound of approaching helicopters added a new dimension to the chaos. News crews were arriving, drawn by reports of Mike Tyson involved in street confrontation with police. The incident was about to become public in ways that would change everything for everyone involved. The explosion had happened not with violence, but with a single gesture of sacrifice that left everyone uncertain about what would happen next. The stakes had just gotten much, much higher. The news helicopters circling overhead changed everything. What had been a neighborhood incident was now becoming a national story, and everyone on Fulton Street understood the implications. Cameras were rolling, reporters were broadcasting live, and the world was watching Brooklyn. Sergeant Rodriguez found himself facing an impossible choice. He could arrest Mike Tyson, as the former champion had requested, but that would create a media spectacle and potentially inflame the already tense crowd. He could try to disperse everyone by force, but with news helicopters recording every moment, any violence would be broadcast live to millions of viewers. Or he could try something unprecedented, actually listening to what the community was trying to tell him. Officer Martinez, who had been watching the situation deteriorate since her arrival, made a bold decision. She stepped forward and addressed the crowd directly, her voice calm but carrying across the street. "I want everyone to know that we heard what you said," she announced. "No one here is a criminal. No one here was breaking the law when this started. We came because someone was worried about traffic, and things got out of hand." Her words seemed to surprise both her fellow officers and the community members. This was not how these confrontations usually went. Admitting fault, acknowledging the community's perspective, these were not standard police tactics. Tyson, still standing between the two sides, felt a shift in energy. The crowd's anger was transforming into something more complex. Hope mixed with skepticism, curiosity about whether things might actually end differently this time. "What Officer Martinez is saying is important," Tyson said, turning to address both the police and the community. "But I want to add something. I came here today because this neighborhood made me who I am. These streets, these people, they gave me everything. And I won't let anyone be disrespected for trying to show me love." His words resonated through the crowd, but he wasn't finished. He turned back to Sergeant Rodriguez, his voice taking on a different tone. "But I also won't let anyone use me as an excuse for violence or destruction. If you want to arrest me for causing a disturbance, fine. But let everyone else go home to their families." The offer created a moment of profound silence. Even the helicopters seemed to quiet their mechanical humming. This was not how these situations typically resolved. Usually, there were arrests, lawsuits, investigations, and years of bitter feelings. But Tyson was offering a different path. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been trying to keep the peace throughout the entire incident, stepped forward. Her voice carried the weight of decades of experience, with both triumph and tragedy in her community. "Mr. Tyson, you don't need to sacrifice yourself for us," she said. "We can all walk away from this if everyone just remembers that we're neighbors. All of us. Even the police. They're part of this community too." Her words seemed to unlock something in the crowd. People began talking to each other instead of shouting at the officers. Parents started collecting their children, not in panic, but in calm preparation to leave. The defensive postures began to relax as the immediate threat of violence receded. Officer Chun, who had been quietly observing the entire interaction, approached Sergeant Rodriguez. Their conversation was brief and private, but its results were immediate. Rodriguez stepped forward and made an announcement that surprised everyone. "After consultation with community members and careful assessment of the situation, we've determined that no laws were broken here today. Everyone is free to go home safely." The relief was palpable, but it came with an edge of disbelief. Could it really be that simple? Could a confrontation that had seemed destined for violence and arrests actually end with everyone walking away? Keisha, whose detention had sparked much of the anger, approached Officer Sullivan. Her wrist still bore the marks of his grip, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "I don't want to press charges or file complaints," she said. "I just want you to understand that we're not your enemies. We're just people trying to live our lives." Sullivan, who had been defensive and frightened throughout the incident, seemed to really see her for the first time. She was young, educated, peaceful, not the threat his training had taught him to expect. His apology, when it came, was quiet but sincere. As the crowd began to disperse, something unexpected happened. Instead of leaving in angry clusters, people began talking to the police officers who remained. Not confrontationally, but curiously. Questions were asked and answered. Phone numbers were exchanged between Martinez and several community leaders. A foundation was being laid for future dialogue. Tyson found himself surrounded by the children who had been watching from the edges throughout the entire confrontation. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and confusion, trying to understand what they had witnessed. "Mr. Tyson," asked a 10-year-old girl named Sarah, "why didn't you fight? Everyone says you're the strongest fighter ever." His answer would be remembered and repeated in the neighborhood for years afterward. "Sometimes, baby girl, the strongest thing you can do is not fight. Sometimes the real victory comes from helping people understand each other." The news coverage that followed was unlike anything anyone had expected. Instead of reporting on Mike Tyson involved in police confrontation, the story became community and police find common ground after tense standoff. The footage of Tyson stepping between two sides, of Martinez acknowledging the community's concerns, of Mrs. Rodriguez calling for mutual respect, these images told a different story than anyone was accustomed to seeing. In the weeks that followed, Officer Martinez was assigned to community relations in the precinct, working directly with neighborhood leaders to prevent future misunderstandings. A community center named after Tyson's trainer, Cuz D'Amato, was established on the very corner where the confrontation had taken place. Young Marcus, the teenager whose call to Tyson had started everything, began training at a police community boxing program that emerged from the incident. But perhaps the most important change was harder to measure. The people of the neighborhood had seen that confrontations didn't have to end in tragedy. Police officers had learned that community members weren't their enemies. And Mike Tyson had discovered that his greatest victory had nothing to do with boxing rings or championship belts. The chaos had been real, the emotions intense, and the potential for disaster enormous. But sometimes, when people choose understanding over anger, when they choose sacrifice over selfishness, even the most volatile situations can transform into opportunities for growth and healing. The helicopters eventually flew away. The police cars returned to their regular patrols, and Fulton Street returned to its normal rhythms. But everyone who had been there that day carried with them the memory of what was possible when people chose to see each other's humanity instead of their differences. Mike Tyson finally completed his walk through the neighborhood, but he was no longer walking alone. He was accompanied by a community that had rediscovered its strength and officers who had remembered their true purpose. The chaos had ended not with conquest, but with connection.